Welcome to another episode of the Moonshine Motorsports podcast. Now, for this episode, I sat down with Dr. Daniel Pierce, a professor at the University of North Carolina in Asheville. Now, he has written a couple of books that you really want to check out if you're listening to this show in particular. Now, the first of those is Tar Heel Lightning, how secret steals and fast cars made North Carolina the moonshine capital of the world. The other one is Real NASCAR, White Lightning, Red Clay, and Big Bill France. Now, you're going to like Dr. Pierce because in his email signature, he calls himself a professional hillbilly. So sit back and enjoy.
Well, first of all, how does a writer who grew up as a PK, a preacher's kid, wind up writing a book on the moonshine trade?
Well, my mother wonders that to this day. But it really started with my interest in NASCAR. In the early '90s, I grew up in Asheville, and I could hear the old Asheville Motor Speedway, on Friday nights, and but that was not something that we did. And I kind of made fun of NASCAR and all that and sneered. And then I had a good friend who had grown up camping in the infield at Charlotte and Darlington and places like that, and just loved it. And he tried to get me to go for years. And finally, when I was finishing up my PhD in Southern history, I thought to myself, I've never been to a stock car race, and I really can't have qualifications if I don't do that. So I went. This is '94, and he had tickets for the Bristol night race, and I had no clue about what that meant or anything. But I went, and I was immediately hooked with that. So I got really interested in NASCAR, and then started looking into the history of NASCAR, and ended up doing a book called Real NASCAR on the early history of the sport. And, was part of the, and of course, one of the big questions that I was looking at in that book was there really a connection between moonshine and NASCAR? And as I put it in the introduction, because there's a lot of mythology out there, as a historian, one of the things you discover as you look deeply into things is that, a lot of those stories just aren't true. Or, the whole, one of the stories about the origins of NASCAR was that in the Atlanta area that these bootleggers went out into cow pastures and started racing one another and everything. And having, a grandfather who was a cattleman and had large pastures, that thought just boggled my mind. I don't think that's possible
Yeah.
to drive through a cow pasture. And so I started looking deeply into it and was very skeptical, really. That of course there was Junior Johnson. He was always brought up, and there's a lot of truth there. I mean, he had the the criminal record to prove it, but I was skeptical. And but as I put it in the introduction to the NASCAR book, the deeper I looked, the more liquor I found. And so, that really got me into the world of looking at moonshine. And then I was asked to do a short little book called Corn from a Jar about moonshine in the Great Smoky Mountains. And then that led into the Tar Heel Lightning book in looking at moonshine in North Carolina. And so, it was a strange journey for sure. And in some ways, it's probably a good thing in that respect that my dad passed away back in '97 and didn't see this direction in my career. But my mother is proud in some ways of it, but she still kind of shakes her head at the whole thing, at the whole moonshine thing.
All right. So I do have to ask, how did you get your doctorate in Southern history and not have a background in NASCAR?
Well,
How,
actually, before I graduated, I did have that, at least the beginnings of a background.
okay. All right. Good deal.
So I graduated in 95. My first NASCAR race was in August of 94. So
Okay. All right. You're off the hook.
okay.
Uh, First things first, I want to get my terminology correct. What's the difference between moonshining and bootlegging?
Okay. Moonshining is the production of
Okay.
of illegal liquor, and bootlegging is the sale or transportation of
Okay.
illegal liquor. And those terms often get used interchangeably, but basically that's the difference right there.
All right. What made North Carolina such a hotbed for
Well, a
making
lot of
liquor?
things. I mean, one, it goes back to the first Europeans that came to North Carolina. They had, from Scotland, the Scots Irish, the English, all these people, even the Swiss, down in New Bern, had long traditions of distilling grains into liquor. And of course they had discovered early on, actually at Jamestown, that you could effectively make good liquor out of distilling corn, which was much more available and much easier to grow in North Carolina. So you had a deep tradition that came with Europeans. A lot of these people brought a still with them, and this became an important part of life prior to the Civil War. Despite the Alexander Hamilton's failed attempt to have a whiskey tax, an effective federal whiskey tax, which was repealed when Thomas Jefferson became president. Um, this was a big part of life. I mean, it was a big part of social life. It was medicine. It was a crucial part of economic life because just about every small farmer and just about every North Carolinian was a small farmer prior to the Civil War. Made liquor. Even on the plantations, I discovered that every plantation had a distillery operated by enslaved people. So it was a crucial part of life. And then along comes the Civil War. And in the war, the federal government passes an excise tax, which, of course, was not enforceable at the time because North Carolina was part of the Confederacy. But after the war, the government started enforcing that. And so people had a decision to make. What do you do? Here's a crucial part of your life. And particularly people, the war economically just had an incredibly horrible impact on the small farmer's life in lots of ways, and they needed the money and the barter power that producing liquor gave them. But they had to make a choice at this point. Okay, um, do you pay the tax? That's not really a viable option because they would get no profit from making liquor whatsoever. Do you quit making it? And many did at that point, because it's now illegal if you don't pay the tax. Or do you find ways to make it illegally? And of course, many North Carolinians did that. I mean, they needed the money, and they saw it as their essentially God-given right. And of course this was a federal law. It wasn't a state law. It wasn't a local law. This is the federal government, and many of these people, of course, being Confederate soldiers and supporters of the Confederacy, didn't see federal laws being particularly viable. That plus the fact that the people enforcing the law were all Republicans because it was a patronage job. So it really, in the late 1800s, it really becomes, despite the best efforts of the government to shut it down, it becomes deeply ingrained, I guess, to throw a little pun in there. But it becomes ingrained in rural society in North Carolina. Well, then, in one of the, in some ways, craziest historical thing that ever happened, and in some ways unimaginable. If you look back at the earlier history, you get prohibition in North Carolina, which comes into effect in the early part of the 20th century. And North Carolina becomes the first state by popular referendum to outlaw alcohol altogether in 1909, so 11 years before national prohibition. And actually, you'd had essentially prohibition on the local level for a number of years there. And so, what prohibition does, it eliminates the legal trade. It gives the illegal operators a monopoly, and it greatly increases the profitability of that enterprise. And so, prohibition in terms of moonshiners, is one of the greatest things you can imagine. In fact, later on, when you have local referenda on opening up legal alcohol, having ABC stores in counties, you could guarantee that the opponents would be the Baptists and the Moonshiners, that they would unite, because the Moonshiners definitely didn't want the competition. But they had a clear field for a long time in North Carolina. Again, the Baptists were their best friends in many ways, because they kept their business profitable. And again, and then when you get national prohibition, it makes it even more profitable. And North Carolina has this reputation for its liquor. And so, they've got a huge market now, and so it's going all up the East Coast and from Western North Carolina up into the upper Midwest. And so they've got a huge market at that point. And again, the strength of prohibition in North Carolina really helps create an environment where as I put it, North Carolina is the moonshine capital of the world by the mid 20th century, for sure.
What kind of rivalry, if North Carolina is the moonshine capital of the world, what kind of rivalry was there with moonshiners and bootleggers in Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia, Tennessee? What kind of rivalry was there, if any?
Well, one of the things that I was really surprised, because all the moonshine movies, like Thunder Road and all these other, they featured these wars between these competing factions, and the shootouts that happen, not only with the revenue agents, but also with rival producers, or, some criminal gang or something like that. And the thing I discovered that just really surprised me was how there was very little of that. And in fact, there was kind of a cooperative relationship. One good example, Junior Johnson, told me, that he had this relationship with moonshiners in Cott County, Tennessee, and which is East Tennessee, and it's one of the Dabney, I can't think of his first name anyway, that did a book on moonshine. He calls one of the moonshine capitals of the world. There are certain counties. Dawson County is one of those in North Carolina, but that's where Junior Johnson's from. But he had this cooperative relationship with the moonshiners over in East Tennessee, and they would go in together and get tractor trailer loads of sugar from New Orleans and split it, and so there's that type of thing. And so it's really kind of surprising that you didn't see more of a rivalry, and as long, I think, as you kind of stayed on your own turf and didn't try to steal customers from other people, that people work together, so it's really an interesting story, and not at all what I expected to find.
How many seem to be in it as a sincere attempt to make ends meet and provide their families, and how many just like living on the ragged edge, the wild side, so to speak?
I think it's kind of for a lot of people, it was kind of a both and kind of deal. Yeah. It wasn't an either or. It was a both and I think for one thing, in terms of kind of male identity in the South, kind of favored outlandish behavior in some ways, and that whole notion of getting behind the wheel of a modified 39 Ford flathead V8 and hauling liquor and outrunning law enforcement down, was very appealing, to these kind of independent minded, as was going on to a stock car track later on. But at the same time, again, that necessity, I think fueled a lot of it, and of course we like the stories about the hauling liquor and the shootouts and stuff like that. But for most people, it was much more low key, and they were more likely to kind of haul it in very quietly through town in the back of a truck. But again, I think it's a both and kind of thing that people, young men like Junior Johnson felt economic responsibility to help support their families. But they also loved the thrill of all of it and that kind of being on the edge all the time. So again, I think both played a role. And then I think there's also something at work here that I call the Breaking Bad syndrome. And if you're familiar with that television show, where the main character, starts out as a way to support his family and has some medical issues that are very expensive and wants to, and so he kind of gets into making meth, but once he gets into it, he's making lots of money and he gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And I think that happened, particularly the people that became the large producers. And you had some individuals in North Carolina who were really, as Junior Johnson called them big time operators. And I think that, that became much more because some of these individuals became very wealthy and their families reap the benefits of that wealth that they accumulated to this day.
How did the automobile change things for the moonshining and bootlegging industry?
Well, it expanded your market dramatically because now you could if you're making liquor in Dawson County, for instance, you're prior to the automobile, your market is pretty much. I mean, you do have examples of people transporting liquor on trains, but it's too public,
Yeah.
And so the automobile makes it so that you can quickly get to, and particularly North Carolina. The state governor of North Carolina was a great friend of Moonshiners through the Good Roads movement by connecting North Carolina with a good system of roads. And so now all of a sudden, if you're in Dawson County, your market's not just Dawson County or Alexander County or whatever, some adjacent county. Your market is, particularly where the people are. And the people were in the mill towns, in places like Gastonia or Statesville or, all those mill towns through there, or larger places like Winston-Salem or Greensboro or Charlotte. And that opens up a whole new market for people. And so the automobile becomes tremendous. I mean, once it first comes in, I mean, it was adopted very quickly by moonshiners. And so they, that was a huge benefit to them to have that. And again, that's the transportation we talk the most about because it's the most interesting in many ways. But again, you got people. Millard Ashley is a good friend. Who was a good friend of Junior Johnson's.
I know we knew Millard. Yeah,
he was a great guy. I tell you, just I really like Millard Ashley. But he transported in the like a a farm truck, and very quietly going through, and he wasn't. Like Clay Call and Junior Johnson and those guys, who has some hopped up Ford or whatever, hauling liquor as fast as they can. But again, that really changed the business in lots of ways and expanded markets. dramatically, and again, helps make it even more profitable.
Ingenuity is part and parcel of making the product. How did that play into working on the cars that hauled the product? They
Yeah,
took a lot of they took a lot of pride in their product. They also took a lot of pride in their cars.
yeah. I think one of the things that I really wanted to do in both the NASCAR and the Tar Heel Lightning book was really dispel one myth, because a lot of the popular image of moonshiners, that these are kind of ignorant rednecks. These people aren't very smart, and they're lazy. One, it's a lot of hard work for one thing, but I've been amazed just looking and hearing the stories of people who were involved, about how smart these individuals were and how creative, and particularly if you have mechanical abilities, you were going places in a lot of these counties because you were in demand. And so, you have people who combine both. You have the Junior Johnsons and the Buddy Schumans and people like that who are deeply involved in the moonshine business, and also have mechanical skills. And then you got others that aren't that deeply involved in the moonshine itself, but they're good mechanics and they are in demand. And so you got these incredibly smart and creative people. I've often talked about Junior Johnson, and he came across, as this kind of slow talking, slow thinking guy, but he's one of the smartest individuals I have ever encountered in my life. And I said this about Junior Johnson, that he may have never read a physics book, but I think he could write one.
Wow. Yeah.
Because he just understood, the way all kinds of things, from aerodynamics to the mechanical workings of an automobile.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just, he was just, as some people would say, scary smart. I mean, and there were a lot of people like that. I mean, that's the thing, the people I got to know, were, they may not, and probably didn't have a high school degree, but these people were so smart and so creative. And, it's really, one of my favorite stories. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but anyway, he was a revenue agent, and he wrote this book about his experience. And actually, he was the guy who caught Junior Johnson at his daddy's still, when Junior got tangled up in a barbed wire fence, but trying to run away. But he wrote about one of his experience of trying to chase down this bootlegger in this souped up car, and he's complained that the government gave him these piece of crap cheapo cars, and that were really no match. But he talked about trying to chase this guy down, thought he was doing pretty good, and then the guy just hits it and just takes off and practically disappeared. But then the guy makes a bootleg turn and comes back towards him, and as he said, it was a game of chicken, and I was a chicken, and so he ran off the road. And but the way he characterized it, I just always loved this analogy. He said it was like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. It was just no contest. But again, it was just, and again, this plays into NASCAR in such a big way, because these people, by necessity, develop these mechanical skills and ability to modify a car into something that, and you get these weird relationships. Like when I grew up in West Asheville, you had Eddie Joyner's Speed Shop, and you had these kind of things all over North Carolina, where these people are importing Edelbrock and and Offenheiser
Yeah.
and all these things from California and other places, to help modify a car and make it go really fast. And again, that feeds into a whole kind of car culture in North Carolina. I mean, if you grew up in North Carolina when I did, I mean, you just saw these jacked up cars all over the place. Now nobody, the young people that jacked up their cars didn't know why they were doing it, but of course that was a way to beef up the suspension, so you could haul lots of liquor and still handle the car. And so, but that kind of fueled into fed into the popular culture, of North Carolina. I mean, these people didn't know why they jacked it up; they just thought it looked cool.
You talked earlier about the mythology of moonshiners, bootleggers getting together in a cow pasture and racing. How far back can informal races between liquor cars be documented?
Well, as Richard Petty put it, he said when the second cat got a car. Yeah. And particularly, I mean, these guys were, adrenaline junkies in many ways, and that fed into it. The whole moonshine thing and trying to outrun the law and that type of thing. But and it became a very competitive thing, and so they would race one another, but not in cow pastures. They'd go out on the highway. And in fact, it was, oh God, I'm trying to think who it was. But anyway, it told me about races on, I think is it 321 that runs through Dawson County and down through Yadkin to Winston-Salem. One of the highways.
421.
421.
421.
Yeah. And so, which is now Junior Johnson Highway, which is ironic, but said they would race from somebody's store in Yadkin County into Dawson County, and regularly. And again, this was a common thing, that these people would have these outside of Atlanta. They, right, actually during World War II, there were huge races with lots of money bet on them between these bootleggers, but they were on the highway, and not oval track races. And so, those again, as Richard Petty said, when the second cat got a car, people were racing again. These bootleggers, they had the best cars and the money to bet on these races and stuff like that. So these became very common. Lee Petty actually it took a while for the family to admit his connections to hauling liquor. I think it wasn't until Martha died that they publicly admitted that. But he was a noted street racer, and he'd have to paint his car because nobody'd race him. He was that good. And of course, which later played out in his career. But they're racing on the roads, and again, this was common everywhere, and people would come out, be late at night and stuff like that. But they'd come out, pretty good sized crowds just to watch these guys race.
Did a lot of the folks who had been involved in moonshining and bootlegging, did they see racing as maybe a way to become legal, to get on the right side of the law?
Yeah.
Or were they just doing it to have something to do to pass the time?
I think, I think it's a both and thing. I think that was an added benefit. Although a lot of them, those early drivers, kept a hand. I mean, Junior Johnson's a good example again. They kept a hand in the illegal business because, racing wasn't paying that much at the time. Where you get that transference from illegal to legal is kind of an untold story that I came across that just really surprised me and that was in track owners who used their ownership of tracks as kind of a way of moving into more legitimate enterprise, and you see this with not only moving into racetrack ownership, but purchasing legitimate businesses. you know, I probably should be more careful talking about this because you can't prove it, but it makes sense that this also helped them in their illegal enterprises as a way to move cash into banks, and it's called money laundering, and it was an important thing to do. You couldn't, these people had lots of cash and they had to do something with it, and so that was a way of doing that, through racetracks, through other legitimate businesses that they purchasing real estate, like Percy Flowers in Johnson County. He bought up half the county, and again, and of course his family has benefited from that to this day, through a legitimate real estate a business in that county. So so there were those connections, and of course, as stock car racing got more profitable, and as purses improved, that was an incentive to move out. But Junior Johnson is still involved in the family business into the late 1950s. And almost went to prison for a second time, and was probably guilty at the time of NASCAR. He was becoming a really big star in NASCAR at that time, and so Bill France and his lawyers helped him out a good bit to stay out of to keep from getting convicted a second time.
Well, there's actually a story in Yadkin County. My wife and I, my family and I, we actually live in Yadkin County. And no Millard and his family. And there's actually a story that Millard went to prison for Junior at one point.
I hadn't heard that, but they were very close friends up until the time that I think Millard preceded Junior in death. But
how did so many of the teams wind up in and around Charlotte?
I think that, I think it goes back to a lot of things. Buddy Schumann, I think, is, was someone who was very instrumental in that. He developed a weird relationship with Ford. And that Ford actually did an investigation of him and said, do we really need to be associating with this guy? But he was so good, that they developed that relationship. And so he was in Charlotte. And then probably the biggest thing in terms of, because people were in different areas. I mean, there was Spartanburg, South Carolina had had a lot of the early teams for one, in Atlanta, and there are other places. But I think when Holman Moody really established themselves in Charlotte, that really kind of set the tone. And then I think it was encouraged over the years by people like Richard Howard, at Charlotte Speedway, and it just kind of grew organically. But I think it had a lot to do with Holman Moody being in Charlotte, and then kind of spinoffs from there, that you had so many businesses connected with supplying parts and things like that. People like Banjo Matthews and who was in Asheville, but again, relatively close proximity to Charlotte, and so I think it just kind of grows organically out of that. And then, of course, the Petty's not, Petty Enterprises, and, I think was really important in terms of getting other teams to see, okay, North Carolina is a good place. We have proximity to what we need, and, lots of skilled people that we can hire, for our businesses. And so it just kind of grows organic. And then once it's established, I think, it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to be in this business, Charlotte or, or Alamance County, or, wherever, or Randleman, is the place to go. if I'm going to do that. And of course, that's true to this day.
I know this is a pretty open-ended question, but what is the fascination with moonshining and bootlegging? I mean, the TV show Moonshiners is popular, has been going on for years. What's the fascination? What's the attraction?
That's something I've thought a lot about, I think it's just, I don't know, it's that, I don't know, that kind of romance of kind of it's kind of like the cowboy in some ways. Here's this independent guy who's making his own way, or actually in many cases I discovered it's an independent woman making her own way, and we like that rugged individualist image, and then you throw in the kind of the romance of running from the law and hiding out and and finding creative ways to do this, that are going to evade law enforcement. That all kind of feeds into that. And so, and again, just the stories are so great. I mean, that was the fun part of this. I've been very fortunate to be in a place, in an academic institution that allows me to do this kind of thing. I have a lot of fun with, again, and I just love, I think my roots, coming from a long line of storytellers that, they're just great stories, and when you start talking about these people and you hear their stories and you just, and it's kind of funny. I've often said Curtis Turner is someone who I've just always been fascinated with, and I got a chance to be in a documentary once about him, and just he's just a fascinating person. And I've often said about Curtis Turner is that, boy, he was fun to watch, but you wouldn't want to be related to him, because of that. But again, I think that's the fun. You can kind of and that was the fun, the attraction of stock car racing. I think for a lot of these mill workers and people who lived, pretty drab lives in many ways here. They could kind of live vicariously through these people. And so I think, and again, because so many people were attached to illegal liquor, I think that, that connection is there. And again, I think it's just kind of a thing that people, like to watch, that kind of thing, to live vicariously, that very exciting life without getting shot at themselves, maybe.
All right, good deal. Anything else you'd like to add? Anything in particular?
No, I think I would just say this, and it's not something I can prove about North Carolina. There's no
never
way.
Let the facts get in the way of it.
Well, they're just you got a problem. One of the challenges of doing research on people that are doing illegal things is that they're not always real forthcoming about that, and you don't have you can't go to their business records or anything like that. But I pretty firmly believe that in terms of production, for a long time in North Carolina, production of illegal alcohol was probably somewhere just behind tobacco, both agriculturally and in the manufacturing, cotton textiles, and furniture. That probably somewhere below furniture, maybe, but maybe not, as you had production of illegal liquor in terms of the economic impact on North Carolina. I mean, it was huge. And no one will ever know exactly what it was, but again, I think it was one of the most important economic activities in North Carolina. And of course, that plays into not only the economics, but culture as well. Again, it's just so steeped in North Carolina, and still out there to this day. Yeah.
Good deal. Good deal. Thank you very much. I saw in your book, the Tar Heel Lightning book, that one of your sources was Brave in Life by Steve Wade. I do a podcast on NASCAR history with him. We both used to work for the Winston Cup Seed newspaper. So,
well, I got to know Steve some, but mainly Tom Higgins. Gosh, get a little choked up there because
yeah.
I missed Tom. He was he was a great source, and and just I spent some good times with Tom, and it was always something that a lot of things that I couldn't put in print. But Tom, was, and of course he was from Yancey County, and then lived in Asheville and got his start really with the Asheville Citizen. And he just, there were so many great stories from Tom, and I got to know Steve a little bit through him. And of course, Tom was also the one that connected me with Junior Johnson, and so I'm always grateful for that. So. So Steve may not remember me, but tell him I said hey. And that book was still is, I think, one of the great books on NASCAR history. So I'm very appreciative of the time they spent with Junior and the things that they were able to find out, about the sport and about this crazy history.
All right, man. Good deal. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed it, Rick.
Okay, man.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us this week for the conversation with Dr. Pierce. Be sure and subscribe to the show on all your favorite podcast platforms and on YouTube. And be sure and check out my regular show on NASCAR history, the Scene Vault Podcast. We'll see you next episode.